Hello, and welcome back to Echoes of Empires. My name is Nick Holmes, and this is episode 132, called The Road to Manzikert. In the last episode, we left the new Byzantine Emperor Romanus Diogenes rebuilding the Byzantine army to stop the Seljuk Turkish raids, which were devastating Byzantine Anatolia. But for 3 years, victory eluded him. That doesn't mean to say he was ineffective. In 1068 and 1069, he led his new army east and confronted Turkish raiders in the passes of the Taurus Mountains. He never lost a battle. The Turks were always scattered. In 1068, he invaded northern Syria, the homeland of the Arab emir of Aleppo, who was using Turkish horsemen as mercenaries. He captured the town of Hierapolis and defeated the emir outside Aleppo. The Byzantine senator Ataliates, our most reliable chronicler, celebrated his victory, saying, quote, "It was therefore during the reign of Romanus that the Romans, or Byzantines as we call them, began to stand up to their enemies, recover their confidence, and fight back." But there was one problem. The Turks were raiders and not an army that could be brought to a pitched battle. Indeed, central to understanding the Byzantine-Seljuk conflict is that the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan didn't want a pitched battle with the Byzantines. He was more interested in defeating his main Islamic rival, the Fatimid Caliphate based in Egypt, and driving it out of the Middle East. The problem was that he had difficulty controlling the nomadic horsemen, who comprised the bulk of his army, since they were more interested in plundering Byzantine cities, and they also liked the vast open grazing land of central Anatolia, which was ideal for their flocks of goats, sheep, and horses. Therefore, the irony that underlay this entire war was that it wasn't the Seljuk Sultan who wanted it. For Romanus, the problem was that he failed to prevent the Turkish nomads from slipping through his defences, bypassing his troops, and sacking 2 cities in the Byzantine heartland, Armorium in 1068 and Iconium in 1069. This was a massive blow to his prestige and played straight into the hands of Caesar John, who was his rival and plotting against him in Constantinople. Indeed, there may well have been a coup attempt in 1070, since Romanus didn't go on campaign that year, staying in the capital probably to keep control of the situation. Romanus was under intense pressure to stop the Seljuk raids, so in late 1070 he resolved to march the largest army he'd yet mustered deep into the east and seize control of the Armenian mountain passes through which the Turkish raiders passed into Anatolia. That way he could block these raids at their point of origin, and to do this he had to take 2 key fortresses about 50 miles apart, Manzikert and Kliat. Romanus left Constantinople in mid-March 1071. As I've mentioned, Caesar John was plotting to overthrow him, and he responded by putting him under house arrest and confining him to his estates in Bithynia. However, he took his son, Andronicus Ducas, with him, and not as a hostage, but as one of his generals. This is surprising, and as you'll soon hear, was to prove a fatal mistake. The reason was, I think, simply that he thought he would cause more trouble if he left him in Constantinople, but by taking him, he had a traitor in his midst. Our main chronicler Ataliates provides an interesting insight into this when he tells us of a serious disagreement between Romanus and his wife, the Empress Eudocia, on the eve of his departure. She refused to accompany him when he crossed the Bosphorus, which is surprising, since their relationship was apparently a strong one, and she'd borne him 2 sons in quick succession. Ataliates says that to patch up their disagreement, Romanus sent her a white dove, which had settled in his hands as he was crossing the Bosphorus by boat. When she received the dove, she immediately ended their quarrel and rushed to join him. They then spent several happy days together before he marched east. So, what was their quarrel about? Attaliates only says that their disagreement was, quote, a result of certain delicate matters which occur between married couples. But I think it could have been a disagreement over politics, since Eudocia was a shrewd political operator herself, and I think she could have seen that it was a mistake to take Andronicus Ducas. Having been married to the previous Emperor Constantine X Ducas, she knew exactly what the Ducas family was capable of. So, in mid-March 1071, Romanus set off from Constantinople, gathering troops as he went. He crossed the Sangarius River over the Zompos Bridge, well known in medieval times, but nothing of which survives today. He crossed the Halys River and advanced to Caesarea, which had been sacked in 1067. From there, he marched to Sebastia. Romanus must have felt confident, since the Byzantine army was probably the largest fielded in the entire 11th century. In addition, he'd tricked Alp Arslan into thinking he wanted peace. As he marched east, he offered him a peace treaty to buy time. Alp Arslan fell for it. According to the Arab sources, a truce of some sort was concluded, resulting in Alp Arslan leaving the Byzantine frontier and advancing to besiege Aleppo, the main Fatimid city in northern Syria, as a prelude to his conquest of the whole of Fatimid Syria. According to the Arab sources, it was only when Alp Arslan realised he was being tricked that he panicked and ordered an immediate withdrawal from Aleppo back to Armenia to meet the Byzantines in battle. His retreat was disorderly, leaving the local levies behind, and when he crossed the Euphrates, many of his men and horses were drowned in the crossing. While he was retreating from Aleppo, Romanus reached Theodosiopolis, the largest Byzantine fortress on the edge of Armenia. With massive walls and a deep moat, it was a bastion against the Seljuk raiders. There reinforcements arrived. Nicephorus Basilakes, one of Romanus's most loyal supporters, brought troops from Syria and Armenia, adding what was in effect the rest of Byzantium's available Anatolian soldiers to Romanus's Cappadocian levies. With these, Romanus now had a large army. Arab and Armenian sources claim it numbered hundreds of thousands, although these numbers can of course be dismissed as an exaggeration. Byzantine sources don't give numbers, but are clear it was the largest army that Romanus had led into battle. Most modern estimates put it at around 40,000 soldiers, an enormous force for its time, and probably twice the size of the armies Romanus had fielded in 1068 and 1069. The great majority of this army were regular Byzantine troops. These included the Western Army, commanded by Nicephorus Bryennius, probably numbering some 5,000 to 10,000 men, together with Armenian infantry, who are mentioned in all of Romanus's campaigns. But many of the soldiers were new Anatolian recruits, especially from Cappadocia. In total, they might have numbered some 20,000 to 30,000. Romanus didn't like mercenaries, and they were limited in number. There were maybe some 1,000 Norman and Frankish knights under the command of Roussel de Bailleul. There were probably more light cavalry in the form of Pecheneg and Oguz Turkish mercenaries, say around 5,000. No sources mention Varangian regiments being present on this campaign, although I think there were some, as I'll explain later. Romanus then did something which has been the subject of intense controversy ever since. He divided the army in two. Following a council of war with his generals, he rejected a defensive strategy and attacked simultaneously the two Seljuk strongholds, Manzikert and Kliat. Michael Attaliates is at pains to explain this was a carefully thought out strategy, contrary to the view expressed by later commentators that it was a major and badly thought out tactical blunder. He emphasises Romanus considered it the best way of taking both Manzikert and Kliat quickly before Alp Arslan arrived with the main Seljuk army. Initially, Romanus sent a strong reconnaissance force towards Kliat, comprising the Pechenegs as well as the Frankish mercenaries under Roussel de Bailleul, to scout out the Seljuk stronghold. But hearing that the Sultan's forces were fast approaching Kliat, he strengthened his attack by sending one of his most senior generals, Joseph Trachaniothes, with a larger force. Attaliates is confusing about the total size of this, stating at one point it was, quote, far more numerous than the soldiers retained by the emperor. Many historians have taken this literally to mean that Romanus dispatched more than half of the army with Trachaniothes. However, I don't think this makes sense, since we know that at Manzikert, Romanus led a very substantial army into battle. I think the answer could lie in confusion over the nuances of meaning in the translation from the medieval Greek. When Attaliates says that the soldiers Trachaniothes took were more numerous than those retained by the emperor, he uses the word retained, which may refer to Romanus's own retainers, meaning his bodyguards and household troops, rather than the entire army. Attaliates says Romanus sent his own bodyguard on this expedition, and I think this was the Varangian Guard, since Attaliates mentions, quote, a sizable body of infantry that joined Trachaniothes, and it's well known that the Varangians were foot soldiers. It would also explain why the Varangians are not mentioned by any source as being present at the Battle of Manzikert. Their departure would have caused Romanus little grief, since he preferred Byzantine troops to mercenaries. So, I think Trachaniothes took most of the mercenaries in a force that might have numbered 5,000 to 10,000, but was much less than half the army. Romanus wanted him to take Kliat as quickly as possible because of news that Alp Arslan's advance guard was already in the area near the fortress. Attaliates says he was worried about a scorched earth policy the Seljuks might employ around Kliat, which would stop the Byzantines living off the land as they besieged the fortress. While Trachaniothes was marching on Kliat, Romanus advanced on Manzikert. He did this with textbook precision. Before leaving Theodosiopolis, he ordered the army to find provisions for the next 2 months, since it would campaign in, quote, uninhabited regions which had been utterly laid waste by the Turkmen tribes. When he reached Manzikert, the army built a fortified camp and palisade outside the city. He brought up siege engines, quote, transported on almost 1,000 wagons, and, quote, innumerable flocks and herds of animals. Clearly, Romanus had organised the logistics of his campaign very well. The Turks in Manzikert shot arrows from the ramparts at the advancing Byzantines, while Romanus rode around the city walls, protected by a shield, looking for the best place to attack. Having found a suitable section of the walls, a regiment of Armenian infantry attacked it, and after fighting all day, they broke through. The Turks surrendered, sending envoys begging for their lives if they handed the city over. Romanus let the Turks leave. His capture of Manzikert was celebrated by the Byzantine soldiers outside the city, who greeted him with, quote, hymns of praise, acclamations, and cries of triumph. Romanus had every reason to feel pleased. With Manzikert secured, he could join Trachaniothes at Kliat, reunite the army, and face the Sultan in battle. But just as he had every reason to feel confident, his plans started to unravel. This began with news that Seljuk forces had attacked Byzantine foraging parties. Romanus sent out one of his senior generals, Nicephorus Bryennius, commander of the Western Army, with a large force to beat the Turks back. Bryennius encountered a more determined Turkish attack than he'd expected. There were confused melees in which the Turks got the better of the Byzantines. Bryennius asked for reinforcements. Romanus's initial reply was dismissive. He thought the enemy facing Bryennius was only a handful of raiders, since Trikaniotes was blocking the main Turkish army at Kliat. However, he changed his mind as further reports of intense fighting came in, and he sent Nicephorus Basilakes to join Bryennius with a large group of Byzantine horsemen. Basilakes was an Anatolian aristocrat, champing at the bit to fight the Turks and take revenge for their brutal sacking of so many Byzantine cities. He immediately led his cavalry out into the open ground to help Bryennius. The Turks retreated, and Basilakes, jubilant with his apparent success, rode past Bryennius's soldiers in pursuit. This proved to be a fatal mistake, since the Turks, masters of the feigned retreat, pulled their horses round and surrounded the Byzantine cavalry. The result was carnage. The Byzantines were cut to pieces. Basilakes was himself unhorsed, surrounded and taken prisoner. When news of this reached the Byzantine camp, Romanus ordered the army to assemble and led it out to face the Turks, who melted away at the sight of such a substantial force. But at nightfall they returned and made another assault, this time against the Oghuz Turkish mercenaries who were stationed outside the Byzantine camp. Because the Oghuz Turks looked similar to the Seljuks, the result was chaos. Ataliates says the situation was made worse by the moonless night, since in the dark the Byzantines couldn't make out who was attacking whom. The Oghuz wanted to be let into the Byzantine camp, but the Byzantine soldiers thought they were Seljuk Turks. The result was the Seljuks slaughtered their Oghuz cousins. Quote, "Death would be, so everyone felt, preferable to what we then witnessed," Ataliates says. After massacring the Oghuz, the Seljuks couldn't break into the camp, but galloped around it, quote, "yelling and screaming, shooting arrows and other missiles, making tremendous, horrifying noises from all sides." The Byzantine army spent a sleepless night. The next day there was another Seljuk attack. This time their target was the far bank of the river next to the Byzantine camp. It was a clever tactical move by the Seljuks, since the Byzantines needed water from the river. But this time the Byzantines were better prepared. Although they'd lost their proficiency as mounted archers, they still had good infantry archers who showered the Turks on the riverbank with arrows, inflicting casualties and driving them away. But just as the Byzantines won this small victory, there was another setback. A group of the surviving Oghuz Turks and some of the Pecheneg cavalry switched sides to join the Seljuks. Our chronicler Michael Ataliates, who was also on Romanus's staff, takes credit for persuading Romanus to demand an oath of loyalty from those who remained. Romanus now realized he was facing the main Seljuk army, commanded by Alp Arslan himself. This was, in fact, the opportunity he'd spent the last 3 years looking for. A chance to win victory in a decisive pitched battle. And there was no doubt he was confident, since he'd defeated every Turkish raiding party he'd encountered in the last 3 years. But there was one mystery that he couldn't explain. What had happened to Trikaniotes? Romanus sent messengers to him, ordering him to return for a decisive battle with the Seljuks. For a whole day he waited for news. But his messengers couldn't find Trikaniotes. He and an important part of the Byzantine army had vanished into thin air. What had in fact happened was that Trikaniotes and his troops had retreated back to the west towards Melitene. The reason for this is one of the greatest mysteries of the Battle of Manzikert, but I think there's a simple explanation: treachery. One reason to believe this is that Trichoniotes was given the coveted governorship of Antioch by the Ducas family after Romanus's death in 1072. And I think this must have been a reward for something, and his betrayal of Romanus would seem to be a good reason. When Romanus was wondering what to do, his mind was made up by an unexpected event. A messenger suddenly appeared to announce that a Seljuk delegation from Alp Arslan had arrived at the gates of the Byzantine camp and asked to see him. Romanus took it seriously, since the delegation was led by one of the Caliph of Baghdad's principal dignitaries, Al-Mulaban, who he'd met before. Romanus treated them with respect and allowed the delegation to enter the camp, giving them an imperial cross as their passport for safe passage. When they proposed a truce, he was elated, since he saw it as a sign of weakness. This was, more than anything else, what convinced him it was right to launch his attack. And it does appear Alp Arslan was genuinely nervous about giving battle. Romanus had a reputation as a good general, and he'd raised a strong army. For the Sultan, a battle against him was far from a certain victory. It's also likely it was a delaying tactic to give him time to bring up more troops. Certainly that was the conclusion Romanus and his generals came to. Thinking he now had the upper hand, Romanus behaved haughtily, forcing the Arabs to prostrate themselves in his presence, a ritual called proskynesis. Before he would even consider discussing a truce, he demanded they abandon their camp and retreat further away. Dismayed, the peace envoys departed without any agreement. The scene was now set for a battle that would change the course of history. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, on the 1st of August, we'll switch to the Seljuk side and consider their rise to power before we look at the Battle of Manzikert itself. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter, where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.